The official history tells us that the mid-1800s marked a period of rapid standardization in public architecture, driven by new materials, shared training methods, and the Industrial Revolution's mass production capabilities. But between 1840 and 1870, something unprecedented happened across the United States and Britain. Government buildings, courthouses, asylums, post offices, and train stations began appearing in dozens of cities simultaneously, not just similar in function but identical in design. We're not talking about inspired imitation or regional adaptation. We're talking about buildings in Maine that look like carbon copies of structures in Missouri, asylums in Yorkshire that share floor plans with institutions in Massachusetts, post offices in Texas built to the same specifications as ones in Scotland. The timeline is tight, the scale is enormous, and the coordination required would have demanded communication networks, architectural distribution systems, and centralized oversight that, according to standard records, didn't exist at that level yet. This isn't about conspiracy. It's about capacity. In 1843, the United States had no Federal Architecture Bureau, no central design authority, no standardized blueprint distribution system. Yet within a single decade, over 200 county courthouses were constructed across 17 states, many of them sharing not just aesthetic style, but exact dimensions, column spacing, and interior layouts. In Britain during the same period, the construction of workhouses, asylums, and municipal buildings followed patterns so uniform that modern architectural historians refer to them as template institutions. But the templates themselves, the original master plans, are either lost, fragmented, or were never formally recorded. The friction point is this: the infrastructure required to distribute, enforce, and replicate these designs at scale would have been more complex than the buildings themselves. Let's start with one example. The county courthouse in Jefferson City, Missouri, completed in 1851, is a Greek Revival structure with a central dome, symmetrical wings, and a specific ratio of window placement to wall surface. In the same year, a courthouse in Bangor, Maine was completed. Same dome, same wings, same ratios. The architects are listed as different people. The contractors were local. There's no documented correspondence between the two projects. Now consider this: both buildings required specialized stone cutting, identical Corinthian column capitals, and the same type of cast iron interior supports, materials that had to be ordered, transported, and installed by separate teams over 1,000 miles apart, with no apparent coordination. One building could be coincidence. Two could be parallel inspiration. But there are dozens. By 1860, there were at least 47 courthouses across the American Midwest and South that shared this exact template. Some variants existed, local stone, minor decorative changes, but the underlying geometry, the structural logic, the proportional relationships, identical. And it wasn't just courthouses. Asylums presented an even stranger pattern. The Kirkbride Plan, named after psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride, became the standard for mental health institutions across the United States and Britain starting in the 1840s. The plan dictated a central administrative building with long, staggered wings extending outward in a shallow V-shape, designed officially to maximize light and air circulation for patients. By 1880, over 70 asylums had been built using this design. From Pennsylvania to Oregon. From London to Edinburgh. Here's the timing issue. Kirkbride published his formal proposal in 1854. But institutions matching his design were already under construction in 1848. Some had been planned as early as 1845. The explanation given is that Kirkbride's ideas circulated informally before publication, through letters, conference talks, and shared professional networks. But the buildings themselves required years of planning, funding approval, land acquisition, and construction. If the design was only being discussed informally in the mid-1840s, how were multiple state governments already breaking ground on structures that would take 5 to 7 years to complete? The administrative choreography alone doesn't quite fit. And then there are the post offices. Between 1850 and 1875, the United States Postal Service oversaw the construction of hundreds of new post office buildings. Many were modest structures. But in county seats and regional hubs, the buildings were grand, 2 or 3 stories, stone or brick, with arched windows, decorative cornices, and clock towers. What stands out is the speed. In 1851, there were fewer than 30 purpose-built post office structures in the entire country. By 1870 there were over 400. That's an average of one new post office every 2 weeks for nearly 20 years. The official explanation is federal investment and westward expansion. The demand was there. The budget was allocated. The construction followed. But the design consistency remains difficult to account for. These weren't prefabricated buildings. They were stone and brick, each one requiring local labor, local materials, and months of on-site work. Yet building after building emerged with the same vocabulary, the same arched entries, the same roof pitches, the same fenestration patterns. In Britain, the same thing was happening with railway stations. Between 1840 and 1860, over 200 new stations were built as the national rail network expanded. The larger stations, terminals in cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, were monumental. Vaulted iron and glass roofs, symmetrical platforms, grand entrance halls, and again identical, not inspired by each other. Identical in engineering, in choice, in structural span. Some of these stations were designed by named architects, Isambard Kingdom, Brunel, George Gilbert Scott, but many were not. Many have no credited designer at all. They simply appear in the records as constructed by the railway company. The scale starts to accumulate. You're looking at thousands of large institutional buildings, courthouses, asylums, post offices, stations, schools, prisons, all appearing within a 30-year window, all sharing design systems that would have required either a centralized distribution mechanism or an extraordinary level of spontaneous parallel development. Neither explanation sits comfortably with the available documentation. Because here's the next part. Many of these buildings were over-engineered for their initial use. Courthouses built for counties with populations under 5,000. Structures with courtrooms that could seat 200, with administrative wings that housed 30 offices, with basements designed for record storage that wouldn't be filled for decades. Asylums designed for 400 patients opened in regions where the entire diagnosed population was under 60. Post offices in frontier towns with marble interiors and vault systems. The mismatch between construction scale and immediate need is everywhere. Which raises the uncomfortable question, not of intent but of origin. The pattern becomes more difficult to dismiss when you look at the infrastructure required to support these buildings, not just the structures themselves but the systems they were designed to connect to. Take water distribution. In the 1850s, dozens of American cities began constructing centralized water systems. Reservoirs, aqueducts, underground mains, pumping stations. Philadelphia's Fairmount Water Works. Boston's Cochituate System. New York's Croton Aqueduct. These weren't small projects. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, was a 41-mile engineering feat that required tunneling through solid rock, building stone bridges across valleys, and installing a distribution network beneath the streets of Manhattan, all to deliver water to a city whose population at the time was around 300,000. The system was designed to serve over 1 million. New York didn't reach 1 million residents until 1875. That's a 33-year gap between capacity and demand. The same over-design shows up in other cities. Cincinnati built a reservoir in 1848 capable of holding 16 million gallons, serving a population of 46,000. The per capita capacity was nearly 10 times higher than what contemporary European cities were installing. In Britain, the story was similar. The Liverpool Waterworks, expanded in the 1850s, delivered infrastructure scaled for a population double what the city had at the time. Manchester's Longdendale Reservoir chain, completed in 1877, was engineered to supply industrial and residential demand that wouldn't materialize until the early 1900s. The official explanation is foresight. City planners anticipated growth. They built ahead of the curve. But the curve they were building for was steep, and in many cases the growth they anticipated didn't arrive on schedule. Some cities never reached the population levels their infrastructure was designed to serve, which means the systems were either wildly over-optimistic, or they were built to a template that assumed a different scale of occupation. Then there's the rail network. The expansion of rail in the United States between 1840 and 1870 is one of the most studied infrastructure projects in history. Thousands of miles of track, hundreds of bridges, dozens of terminal stations. But one detail often gets lost. The rail network was laid out before settlement patterns were fully established. Look at the Erie Canal, completed in 1825. It's celebrated as a feat of early American engineering, 363 miles connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. The canal opened up the interior of New York State, created new trade routes, and spurred the growth of cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse. But here's the timing issue. Construction began in 1817, when most of the regions the canal would pass through were unsettled. The western portion of New York had a sparse population. There were no major towns along the proposed route. No industrial centers. No significant agricultural output. The canal wasn't built to serve existing demand. It was built in anticipation of demand that didn't yet exist. And it worked. Towns grew up around the canal. Commerce followed the water. Within 20 years, the corridor was thriving. But the question remains, who decided in 1817 that this specific route, cutting through wilderness, requiring the construction of 83 locks, 18 aqueducts, and the excavation of millions of cubic feet of earth, was worth the investment? The scale of foresight required is extraordinary. Now apply that same logic to the Transcontinental Railroad. Construction began in 1863. The route cut through territories with almost no permanent settlement. Entire sections of the line ran through land that had no towns, no roads, no infrastructure of any kind. The railroad wasn't connecting existing cities. It was placing track where cities would eventually be built. And they were. Towns sprang up along the line, often at intervals that matched the operational needs of the railroad itself. Water stops, fuel depots, maintenance yards. These weren't organic settlements. They were planned nodes placed at precise distances, built to support the railroad before there was any other reason for them to exist. The same pattern appears in Britain. The Great Western Railway, engineered by Brunel in the 1830s and 1840s, didn't just connect London to Bristol. It created a corridor of new development, with stations placed in locations that had no prior significance. Reading, Swindon, Bath, towns that grew because the railway made them hubs. The infrastructure preceded the population. This isn't unusual in isolation. Infrastructure often drives growth. But the scale and simultaneity are what stand out. Because it wasn't just railroads. It wasn't just water systems. It was administrative buildings, prisons, schools, hospitals, telegraph lines, gas lighting networks, sewer systems, all of it appearing within the same narrow window, all of it built to a similar scale, all of it designed with a consistency that required coordination, whether formal or invisible. Let's talk about the administrative buildings again because this is where the template effect becomes undeniable. In the United States, county governments were established rapidly as new territories were organized and admitted as states. Each county needed a courthouse, a jail, a records office, often a poorhouse or asylum. Between 1840 and 1870, over 300 new counties were created. Each one built the same set of institutions, and the buildings looked the same. Not similar, the same. County courthouses in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, separated by hundreds of miles, built by different contractors, funded by different governments, share floor plans, facade treatments, and structural details so specific that modern restoration architects can use photographs from one building to reconstruct missing elements of another. The explanation usually given is pattern books, published architectural guides that showed builders how to construct buildings in popular styles. Greek Revival, Italianate, Second Empire. Pattern books did exist. Asher Benjamin's The American Builder's Companion, published in 1806, was widely used. Minard Lefever's The Modern Builder's Guide came out in 1833. But pattern books provided decorative details, cornice moldings, doorway treatments, column proportions. They didn't provide full structural plans. They didn't specify dimensions, load-bearing systems, or interior layouts. Yet the buildings aren't just decorated the same. They're built the same. Same room sizes, same ceiling heights, same placement of staircases, same thickness of exterior walls. That level of replication requires more than a pattern book. It requires blueprints. It requires exact measurements. It requires a distribution system capable of getting identical plans into the hands of builders across a continent. And there's no documented system that did that. No federal architecture office. No centralized planning authority. No national building standards. Just building after building after building, all appearing at once, all looking like they came from the same hand. In Britain, the same phenomenon occurred with workhouses. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 mandated the construction of workhouses across England and Wales, institutions where the destitute could receive shelter in exchange for labor. By 1850, over 600 workhouses had been built. They were nearly identical. The official architect was Sampson Kempthorne, who designed a standard model in the 1830s, a cruciform layout with separate wings for men, women, children, and the infirm. His design was adopted as the template. But Kempthorne couldn't have supervised 600 construction sites. He couldn't have ensured compliance across the entire country. He published plans, yes, but translating plans into buildings requires skilled labor, material procurement, and on-site decision-making. Yet the buildings are uniform. Same proportions, same materials, same construction techniques. Whether this reflects a level of institutional control that isn't fully recorded, or a shared architectural knowledge that operated informally, the result is the same. A built environment that looks centrally planned, even when the mechanisms of that planning aren't visible. And that's before we address the Tartaria question directly. The term Tartaria originally referred to a vast, vaguely defined region on European maps, stretching across Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of what is now Russia and Mongolia. It wasn't a single empire. It was a geographic label for territories that European cartographers didn't fully understand. By the 19th century, the term had faded from official use. But in recent years, it's been reinterpreted, used as a shorthand for a different kind of question. Not about a hidden civilization, but about architectural inheritance. About whether the institutional buildings of the 1800s were entirely new constructions, or whether they represented adaptation, reconstruction, or reoccupation of older frameworks. The modern Tartaria interpretation isn't monolithic. It exists on a spectrum. On one end, the idea that these buildings reflect a previous phase of centralized development, perhaps from an earlier period of global trade, colonial expansion, or infrastructural ambition that was disrupted, fragmented, or reorganized. That the uniformity we see isn't creation from scratch, but reassembly. In the middle, the possibility that what we call rapid 19th century expansion was actually a phase of rebuilding following large-scale disruption, whether from war, climate events, or economic collapse. That the infrastructure was over-engineered because it was being restored to a prior standard, not invented for the first time. On the other end, symbolic interpretation. Tartaria as metaphor, a way of describing the unsettling feeling that the official timeline doesn't fully account for the scale, speed, and coordination visible in the built environment. None of these interpretations require conspiracies. They're asking a simpler question. Does the available documentation fully explain the physical evidence? Consider 1816, the year without a summer. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia caused global cooling, failed harvests, and widespread social upheaval. Entire regions depopulated. Infrastructure collapsed. The recovery period that followed, the 1820s through 1850s, is the exact window when this wave of institutional construction began. If you view the architectural boom as recovery rather than expansion, the over-engineering makes more sense. You're not building for projected growth. You're rebuilding to a known standard. This doesn't require belief in a lost empire. It's a question of whether disruption and reconstruction are being underrepresented in conventional narratives. The metaphor version of Tartaria simply says, something about the mid-1800s feels compressed. The density of development, the uniformity of design, the mismatch between scale and population, all of it creates a cognitive friction that the standard explanations don't quite resolve. Maybe the answer is better record-keeping than we assume. Maybe it's informal networks that worked more efficiently than formal ones. Maybe it's parallel development driven by shared constraints and available materials. Or maybe the timeline itself is more layered than it appears. The buildings are still standing. The courthouses, the asylums, the stations, the aqueducts, they're real. The timing is documented. The scale is measurable. What remains open is how we interpret the gap between what was built and what the records say was possible. The evidence invites examination. The questions remain unresolved. And that discomfort, that sense that the pieces don't quite fit, is worth sitting with.